In the busy heart of Chicago, where buildings soar to the sky and aspiration pulsates like electricity, as the youngest son of Kent Parker, a once powerful businessman whose name was synonymous with wealth and scandal in New York City, Peter Parker, the 24-year-old heir to a collapsing empire, led a life marked by luxury and negligence. The Parker family lived in an opulent penthouse on the Upper East Side, a neighborhood where old money and new dreams mixed with an air of exclusivity. From the custom Italian clothes that adorned his closet to the rare vintage wines that filled his glass, Peter had never known a life without the comforts of immense riches and privilege. As the story opens, we find Peter relaxing in the spacious living room of the penthouse, a space decorated with priceless paintings and panoramic views of the city, to the sound of a grand piano. Every aspect of his existence was meticulously planned, yet at its core, hollow. One of his two older twin sisters, Cynthia, plays softly in the background as the other twin, Keisha, sits next to him and flips through a high-end fashion magazine. "Peter, have you considered working with Dad at the company?" CH stops her flight to look at him, and her query lingers there in the air among the soft strains of a Boven sonata. With a dismissive sneer, "You know I have no head for business, Cynthia. Why bother pretending?" Peter shifts uncomfortably, swirling the wine in his glass. The air thickens with tension as Keisha looks up with piercing eyes. "It's not about pretending, Peter. It's about responsibility, something you've conveniently avoided all your life." Within the family, Peter was well known for his contempt for responsibilities. He spent his days hopping from one leisure activity to another, and his nights becoming lost in the gloom of exclusive social clubs and private gatherings. "When everything I need is handed to me, why should I work hard for it?" Peter laughs as he stands to refill his glass. In order to spare his children from hardship, the father constructed this empire. Peter founded the empire, not you, and as you can see by looking at the Romans, empires can fall just as quickly as they rise. Cynthia Resume is playing the music now, a gentle lament. As usual, Peter dismisses her words with the dramatic gulp of his wine. "Dad has made sure that Cynthia's empire would last long after we are gone." Yet later that night, as the city lights flickered like far-off stars, doubts were planted. Peter was standing at the window, his reflection on the glass appearing spectral. Although he appeared to be dismissive, a part of him, worried about the frailty of their luck, was burdened by his sister's words. As evidence of his fortunate life, Peter's regimen continued the following morning when, promptly at 8 a.m., his personal trainer showed up and led him through an exercise session in the private gym in the house. When he ate his father's breakfast, it was a gourmet affair made by their chef, complete with truffled eggs and smoked salmon. Kent Parker accompanied him. Kent was a strong, attractive man in his early 60s, with silver hair and a captivating, dominating manner. "Peter, it's time for you to get familiar with the office. I need you to start coming in," Kent stated, sounding non-argumentative. "Dad, you know I'm not cut out for that. So why push it when the real world isn't as forgiving as I am?" Peter scowled and put down his fork. "You have to learn how to stand on your own 2 feet, Kent retorted sharply. The conversation was interrupted when Edna Price, Wright Peter's mother, arrived. Edna was a refined and composed woman who had previously worked as an attorney, and was afraid of many of Kent's business judgments. Kent gently touched Peter's shoulder and said, "Let the boy enjoy his youth. There's plenty of time for work." Kent glanced between his wife and son, his expression softening. In the privacy of his room, surrounded by the opulence of wealth, Peter was aware of the undercurrents of tension that occasionally surfaced between his parents over his future, but he also felt a mixture of relief and frustration at his parents' departure from this world that changes quickly. Peter considered his options. Would he accept the role his father had given him? Or would he go to his current course of mindless indulgence outside of Chicago, moving with unrelenting intensity and disregarding the people watching from his guardian angel? Ed Cage caught between legacy and desire. The day waned, and as night fell over the city, Peter dressed for another evening out, his mind unsettled, his future uncertain. As Peter prepared to leave his penthouse for a night out, the cacophony of the city below seemed a world away, yet strangely soothing. He was dressed impeccably, a tailored suit hugging his frame, testament to the casual opulence that had defined his life. The night air was crisp, and the city's lights twinkled like a constellation designed just for him. But as he stepped into the elevator, descending from his high-rise haven to the bustling streets of Chicago, Peter couldn't shake the unease planted by his father's words earlier that day. Meanwhile, not far from the Wright family's residence in a nondescript office building filled with the hum of activity and low whispers, a different scene was unfolding, one that would send shock waves through Peter's world. Federal agents, armed with warrants and steely determination, were preparing to make a move that had been months in the making. They had gathered undeniable evidence of fraud, embezzlement, and a slew of other financial crimes, all pointing to one man, Parker Kent, unaware of the storm. Peter's first few hours of the evening passed in a whirl of laughing and alcohol brewing. He strolled with the ease of someone familiar among his favorite places. Unaffected by adversity, it was already far after midnight when his phone began to beep non-stop in his pocket. Eventually, he took it out and scowled as the screen revealed multiple missed calls from his mother. "Edna, mother, what is it?" Peter's voice was heavy with frustration at his indulgences and their consequences. "Peter, you must now return home." A chilly sense of dread flooded over him as he asked, "It's your father. There's been an incident. The police have taken him." Edna's anxious voice was a dramatic contrast to her normally serene manner. The words hit Peter like a punch to the body, causing him to stagger a little. He could hear his buddies laughing far away, and his world began to spin. What are they saying that he's done? This is serious, Peter. It was a painful ride back to the penthouse. Please just go home. When Peter arrived, the scene was chaotic, with police cars blocking the street and officers moving in and out of the building. His countenance was serious. Peter's mind was racing, trying to piece together what could have led to his father's detention. Peter ran upstairs, his heart thumping his chest. The P house was a flurry of activity, with officers confiscating computers and papers and sorting through paperwork. In the middle of it all stood Edna, drew a strong picture of despair with her pale face. Peter cautiously walked up to her. "Mom, tell me what's going on. Why are they taking Dad's stuff? And where is he?" "Peter," said Edna, inhaled deeply, her voice hardly audible above a whisper. "Money laundering, embezzlement, and fraud." Peter felt the room spin around him, thinking, "This can't be happening," sinking into a chair as his legs gave out. It must be a mistake. But as the hours passed, and the reality of their situation set in like a thick fog, the list goes on. Your father has been working on the case for months. The corporate world's most feared and revered figure, Kent Parker, had been involved in illicit operations that threatened to destroy not just his empire, but also the future of his family. The days that followed were occupied with rushed legal consultations and the unpleasant presence of federal officials. As the court fights progressed, the media swooped like vultures, questioning Peter and his sisters and scrutinizing every word they said. The privilege they had always known was replaced by suspicion and judgment. Every time a member of the appropriate family went outdoors, cameras flashed and reporters yelled questions. They would question, "Peter, how do you feel about your father's arrest?" while shoving microphones in his direction. Peter's customary charisma left him in favor of a skull and a swift escape, leaving Kent in custody pending his trial. One evening, as Peter sat in the now quiet and dimly lit living room, Edna joined him, a stack of bills and legal papers in her hands. "We need to talk about the future, Peter, about what we're going to do now." The financial repercussions were immediate and devastating. Assets were frozen, accounts were scrutinized. The wealth of the Wright family began to evaporate under the weight of legal fees and frozen business operations. The lavish lifestyle Peter had taken for granted crumbled day by day. Haggard's eyes were exhausted. "What can we do, Mom? Our lives are crumbling." "We fight, Peter, trying to salvage what we can, and preparing for what is ahead. It won't be simple, but we must confront this head-on." With his new reality bearing down on him, Peter nodded. Peter became aware of his weakness for the first time. As the empire his father had established began to fall apart, a legacy built on sand, the once opulent penthouse, which had echoed with laughter and the clinking of fine china, now lay silent, a testament to the Wright family's swift and stark downfall. As the legal battles continued to drain their resources, the future was uncertain, the path ahead fraught with challenges. But one thing was certain: the days of ignorance and indulgence were over. Beautiful furniture and priceless artwork that had decorated their home started to vanish and were auctioned off in a last-ditch effort to pay for the growing costs and attorney bills. One morning, Edna sat Peter down in the kitchen. Their staff had long since left the room empty of the typical aromas of gourmet cooking. Peter, who had once been the life of every party, found himself wandering through the sparse, echoing rooms, the reality of his new circumstances slowly sinking in. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her worry. "That we've had to let go of the staff, and there will be other adjustments." The mixture of uncertainty and annoyance in Peter's voice said, "What kind of adjustments do we need to make to downsize? And you need to find a job?" Time for a job, Peter thought. The word seemed abstract and distant, meant for other people rather than for him. Here he was, thrust into a world he had never imagined, much less prepared for. He asked, in a skeptical tone, "What can I do? You know, I've never worked a day in my life." "It may be true, but it's never too late to start," Edna answered in a strong voice, saying, "Maybe it will be beneficial for you to understand the value of hard work." Peter scoffed, but the sight in his mother's eyes prevented him from continuing the argument. He was ashamed of the job search, even though he realized it was a serious matter. Following numerous rejections, Peter eventually landed a job at a fast food restaurant, ironically, one he used to frequent during his late-night adventure respite, having no real skills or work experience, leaving him at the mercy of skeptic hiring managers who felt he was either overqualified due to his family name or underqualified due to his lack of experience. Peter awoke to a rude awakening on his first day of work. His uniform was uncomfortable and itchy, unlike his custom suits. The work was hard and very different from the relaxing days he was used to. Peter found himself behind the counter taking orders, interacting with impatient customers, and struggling with the cash register. Peter's manager, a burly man called Andre, was not amused by Peter's slow pace and threatened to make him account to him if he continued to mess up the orders. "Hurry up, we have a line out the door," he yelled. Lunch rush hours were the hardest, so Peter swallowed his pride and nodded pitifully to Andre and the patrons. Every order he took was a hit to his ego, and every complaint served as a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. The unending influx of patrons by the conclusion of his shift, the cacophony of commands screamed over sizzling fryers, and the grease-slicked air had become unbearable, in stark contrast to his prior existence, where fatigue was caused by nights of rough sleep rather than hard labor. Peter was emotionally and physically drained, and going home did not provide any respite. Now that the penthouse had lost its splendor, it felt more like a jail than a place of refuge. One evening, after a particularly taxing day, Peter collapsed onto the couch, his body aching, his spirits at an all-time low. His sisters, Keisha and Chloe, were out most days, busy with their own attempts to forge new paths in the suddenly real world. Edna, who had been going through some papers, looked up and noticed the despondency in her son's eyes. "Hard day?" she asked, her voice softening as she took in his disheveled appearance. "You could claim that." Peter laughed ironically. "I never thought it would be this difficult." Edna took a seat next to him, her expression compassionate but firm. "Peter, I know this is difficult, but it's vital. Because you're learning so much about the world and yourself from this experience. If you allow it, it will change you for the better." Peter's weariness was evident in the way he gazed at his mother. Edna reached out and put a comforting hand on his shoulder, saying, "You're not lost." "I just feel so lost, Mom. I feel like I don't belong in that world, or any world, for that matter." "Peter, you're just starting out on a new path. So it's acceptable to feel overwhelmed as long as you keep going." When the days passed into weeks, Peter's thoughts about the conversation continued long after he went to bed. As he lay in bed in the dark, listening to the far-off sounds of the city, he couldn't help but wonder about his future. Called he adjust to this new life and whether there would be a place for him in a world where his name no longer opened doors, but instead raised barriers. Months had passed since Peter began working at the fast food restaurant. And with each shift, the veneer of his former life continued to peel away. The pride he once felt in his last name was replaced by a burgeoning sense of self-reliance forged in the unlikeliest of places behind the counter of a fast food restaurant. But the journey was only beginning, as Peter faced the harsh realities of his new life every day, and learned the value of a dollar earned rather than inherited. Peter was originally somewhat relieved by this fund, a recall of better days, unaffected by the reach of federal agents or the legal tumult surrounding his father's case. But it quickly became both his lifeline and his doom. One cold evening following an especially demanding workday, Peter found himself at an upscale bar he was familiar with and often visited. Reminiscences of his former life clung to the dark corners of the establishment like cobwebs. And as he sat there sipping a far less expensive drink than he used to order, he overheard two well-dressed businessmen discussing investments and rapid financial gains. Motivated by a combination of nostalgia and desperation, Peter turned to face them, his curiosity piqued. He apologized for interrupting, "But did you know that there's a method to make a quick profit these days?" His tone was both eager and embarrassed. Looking at Peter's worn-out clothes, and recognizing the remnants of a man accustomed to wealth, one of the men, a slick individual with a sharp suit and sharper gaze, turned towards Peter with a speculative look in his eye. "Well, it depends on how much you're willing to risk, and how quickly you want to return to your lifestyle," he said. "I own some resources." "What are you suggesting?" That Peter was introduced to high-risk stock trades and other speculative investments. During that conversation, Peter decided to enter this dangerous financial world, using his trust fund to fuel his ventures. And over the next few weeks, his life became a whirlwind of trading apps, market reports, and increasingly reckless financial bets, driven solely by his desire to regain his lost status. As is often the case with such risks, the tide quickly turned, and a series of poor investments wiped out significant portions of his fund. But the desperation to recover his losses only drove him deeper into folly. He started going to casinos, believing he could beat the odds with the right amount of luck and some of the old charm that had once opened doors for him. One night, amidst the clatter of slot machines and the murmur of hopeful patrons, each successful trade emboldened him, and every loss was met with a double-down attempt to recoup his days off. Peter found himself at a blackjack table, his heart thumping as he staked what was left of his trust fund. Within moments, his last vestige of financial security disappeared, leaving him stunned. The early morning air bit his cheeks, making him flushed. The weight of what he had done, squandered. His last financial safety net, settled like a stone in his stomach. He walked aimlessly through the streets, the rising sun casting long shadows that mirrored his despair. His phone rang, and it was Edna, her anxious, sharp voice. Peter stopped, leaning against a cold building wall. "I made a mistake," he said. "Where are you, Peter? It's early morning, and you haven't come home." There was a pause on the line, filled with disappointment and worry. "Mom, I've lost everything." Edna was waiting for Peter when he eventually got back to the penthouse, her expression a mix of grief and rage. "Come home. We need to talk." "Peter, this has to stop. You've reached your lowest point. And you need to realize that you can't go after what's lost. Now is the time to rebuild, but in the proper way." This occasion, overwhelmed by the enormity of his mistake, Peter collapsed onto the couch with his head in his hands. "Mom, I'm not sure if I can. I'm not sure where to begin." Edna took a seat next to him. Her voice was forceful yet gentle, and she said that the first step in changing your demeanor is to accept who you are and decide what you want to be. This is your opportunity to redefine who you are. A faint spark of resolve began to kindle within Peter Parker as he sat there, listening to his mother's advice and considering his next steps. Perhaps in the depths of his despair, there was a chance for redemption. A chance to build something of his own, something real and lasting. As the weeks turned into months and the harsh realities of his new life firmly took hold, Peter Parker found himself at a crossroads. His mother and son were grappling with the ruins of their past and the daunting task of forging a new path for Peter, reluctantly admitting that he needed to change. But his longings for his previous way of life lingered like embers under, waiting for a breeze to fan them one night, in an attempt to reunite with some semblance of his former social circle. The invitation to the charity gala was accepted with hesitation by Peter. This was a world he had once traversed with ease and entitlement, but now he approached it nervously, wearing a borrowed suit and feeling like an imposter in his former domain. The event took place at a lavish hotel, with a ballroom that was illuminated by chandeliers that glistened and surrounded the elegantly attired guests. As he made his awkward way around the room, Peter felt a pang of nostalgia mixed with unease. The murmur of the throng and the clink of fine glassware provided a soundtrack to a life he no longer led. Suddenly, his eyes fell on a person who seemed completely at home, and yet strangely out of place. He was familiar with Cassandra Thompson from Society. Pages was an exquisite older woman who was well known for both her philanthropic work and her success in the financial world. Her striking silver hair and tasteful yet opulent clothing befitted her status. Cassandra was encircled by admirers, her sincere and clear laughter resonating. As he watched her, a desperate and disgusting plan began to take shape in his mind. He was aware of her money and influence, and in a moment of weakness, brought on by his yearning for the past, he saw in her a way to achieve his goal of calling forth his former appeal. "Mrs. Thompson," Peter walked up to her, and his pulse raced with determined intent rather than attraction or even adoration. "Peter Parker here." With a practiced smile, he extended his hand and remarked, "It's truly an honor to meet you." Cassandra turned to face him, her eyes piercing but not cruel. "Peter, your Wraith name sounds familiar. I think I heard about your family's recent troubles." She answered, her voice hinting at curiosity. "Yes, it's been a difficult time." Peter acknowledged that his vulnerability had colored his tone. "But like you, I'm trying to figure out how to move forward and live a meaningful life." With a nod, Cassandra seemed to be appreciative of his candor. She remarked, "Life throws us curveballs, but how we respond defines us." Her eyes were analyzing him seriously as the talk progressed, and Peter felt comfortable sharing more about his troubles with her. Cassandra listened to her expression of understanding, and maybe a trace of sympathy. Even if he was portraying himself as a victim of circumstance and trying to restore not just his money, but also his character. His voice was tinged with the grief he did not really feel. While it's never easy to start again, those who do so frequently go on to create the most robust futures. As the evening went on, she gave counsel mixed with encouragement. Peter, for his part, did a fantastic job creating a story that was both touching and pathetic. He left the gala carrying Cassandra's business card and an invitation to get coffee to talk about possible business guidance. Strolling outside into the crisp night, a mixture of triumph and self-disgust overtook Peter as he looked back at the glistening hotel. He had laid the groundwork for what he hoped would be a return to luxury, using Cassandra as his unwitting benefactor, but beneath the surface of scheming there was an undeniable awareness of the moral line he was preparing to cross. This encounter, he knew, could either be the beginning of his ascent back to wealth or the final descent into a moral abyss from which there would be no recovery. After the spectacular event, fading into the night, Peter realized that the road he was on would be dangerous for his conscience and soul. Even though he appeared successful and showed resolve at the charity event, Peter was internally tormented by his growing plan. But the allure of his former life, the seductive pull of luxury and ease, proved too strong to resist. Days passed before Peter finally found the courage, or rather the justification, to reach out to Cassandra. Sitting in his now sparsely furnished living room, he composed a message that was carefully calibrated to evoke sympathy without seeming too desperate. Peter found himself returning to the card Cassandra Thompson had given him almost daily. To Mrs. Thompson, he started typing, his fingers twitching a little bit. "I can't even begin to tell you how much your words from the other night meant to me. Could I have the honor of buying you coffee? I find myself at a crossroads and I am looking for advice from someone whose life's work I greatly appreciate. Warm regards. I am forward to learn from your extensive knowledge and maybe share a little more about my path. Parker." Peter, before sending the message, he read it multiple times, each time becoming more conscious of the shady nature of his request. Cassandra quickly answered, arranging to meet him later that week at a charming cafe she had previously visited. A rush of excitement immediately overcame Peter's remorse when they first met on a clear Thursday morning, with the cafe teeming with the quiet murmur of early risers and the clinking of china. When Peter arrived, Cassandra was already there. A picture of poise and grace was there too, wearing an exquisite suit and a loving smile, but Peter could also see a depth of pain in her eyes that she had not shown before, as apparent at the gala. "Peter, nice to see you again. Thank you, Mrs. Thompson, for meeting with me." Cassandra welcomed him, her voice a reassuring melody that masked the undertone of her recent widowhood. "I am very grateful for it." As they ordered their coffee, Peter responded, easing into the chair across from her, his countenance schooled into one of sincere gratitude. The topic of Cassandra's profession and charitable endeavors automatically came up, and eventually the discussion shifted to her recent personal upheavals. "I can only imagine how difficult it must be to have shared a life with someone, to build a world together, and then to find oneself navigating it alone," Cassandra said, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her coffee cup. Cassandra talked about her late husband with a fondness that resonated with genuine love and profound loss. Since then, she has faced challenges, and her professional success hasn't been able to fill the void. At times, it's been overwhelming. Peter nodded sympathetically, his mind calculating even as his face displayed deep compassion. The aftermath's silence. Cassandra gave him a long look before responding, "Yes. It has been quite the journey," with a touch of vulnerability in her voice as she seized the moment. "If it's not too daring to say, I would be pleased to offer my company to Mrs. Thompson. Perhaps by sharing our experiences, we might find comfort in each other's understanding." Peter moved forward a little and spoke in a low, serious voice. Cassandra took a moment to contemplate his offer before gently nodding. "That would be nice," she said. "I appreciate your kindness." Peter, as they carried on their conversation, by the time they parted ways, Peter had arranged another meeting, and, more importantly, a tentative foothold in Cassandra's life. He reasoned that, in the world he came from, survival often required one to dance on the edges of morality. and that, if he had to manipulate the threads of a wealthy widow's loneliness to weave back into a life of affluence, then he would do so. Peter listened intently, not just to respond, but also to weave himself into the narrative of her life. Slowly, an indispensable Peter was adamant about sticking to his predetermined course. Even at the expense of his soul or the innocent, Peter made his first inroads into Cassandra Thompson's life. And over the next few months, he became a more major influence in her life. Their regular cafe meetings gave way to going to social gatherings, where Peter, ever the charmer, played his part with cold precision. Every public appearance was a step in his intricate seduction dance, meant to win Cassandra's acceptance as more than just a confidant. Peter's inherent charm and his increasingly elegant appearance, which is subtly funded by tiny sums of, despite the buzz their friendship generated among the elite. Peter maintained the facade of the supportive friend while weaving a deeper emotional connection with Cassandra. He listened intently to her, and his thoughtful responses always highlighted his understanding and empathy towards her situation. Cassandra insisted on gifting him for his business ventures, which allowed him to blend seamlessly into her world. They were seen together at charity gala, art exhibitions, and high-profile business events. Peter sensed the time was right to advance their relationship. One chilly autumn evening, as they strolled through the botanical gardens for a charity function, beyond simple companionship, the gardens shone with soft lights, the delicious smell of blossoming chrysanthemums enveloping their route, and the mellow sound of a nearby fountain. "Cassandra, I've wanted to say," Peter spoke quietly at first, but there was a serious undertone to his words. "These past few months with you have been extremely meaningful to me." A little taken aback, Cassandra looked up at him, her expression softening. Peter said, "I feel the same. You've brought a lot of joy into my life at a time when I needed it most." Peter stopped walking and turned to face her. The garden surrounding them seemed like a private universe bathed in the evening's golden glow. He reached out and gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. He said, "Cassandra, there's something more I've been wanting to express." His deliberate leaning and kiss was meant to evoke passion and tenderness. But as their lips met, Cassandra stiffened, giving away that she was uncomfortable at first. Peter sensed her reluctance, but before she could back away, he intensified their kiss and gave it all the fake warmth and desire he could summon in the aftermath of a heated exchange. Peter peered into Cassandra's eyes, searching for any hint of regret, but she seemed to dissolve into the kiss as their first resistance faded. From that night on, their relationship gradually took on the public veneer of a romance. Their once casual encounters became charged with an undercurrent of intimacy, and Peter was adept at maintaining the right balance of affection and respectability in public. As the year came to an end, they approached the anniversary of their first official date. Cassandra appeared briefly conflicted, but then gave a faint smile, a nonverbal concession that she was not entirely opposed to this new turn in their relationship. There had been difficulties along the way. In spite of all of this, Peter remained unfazed. His every action and gesture of affection towards Cassandra, though motivated by self-interest, was expertly executed to allay doubts and solidify his position. He countered the skepticism with acts of public devotion, and, in private, he reassured Cassandra of his sincerity, always mindful to keep her trust and to deepen their bond. Cassandra's adult children were skeptical of Peter and wary of his motivations, given their mother's wealth and his previous notoriety. Colleagues and friends whispered some bluntly in their concerns, while others were simply curious about the suddenness of their pairing. Peter knew that as the new year progressed, he would need to move quickly to implement the next part of his plan. As he watched the fireworks light up the sky, his eyes were reflecting not the light of the explosions, but the cold fire of ambition and calculation. Peter was prepared to play the game to the very end, with their almost year-long relationship blossoming in the public eye. Despite the whispers and tired looks of onlookers, Peter's calculated charm had cemented himself firmly in Cassandra's life. Her trust in him was strengthened by his constant attentiveness and the seeming genuine warmth he displayed, but beneath the surface of these tender moments was a cold, methodical calculation. On a cold February evening, as the city started to emerge from the winter chill, Peter was getting ready to secure his future, which he felt rightfully belonged in the highest echelons of wealth and comfort he had known. He had carefully planned this decision, picking a significant and picturesque location, the garden, where he had first transitioned from friendship into romance with Cassandra. As they walked through the botanical gardens, Peter's voice was carefully modulated to carry just the right amount of nervousness and excitement. The setting sun cast a golden glow, turning the sky into a canvas of oranges and pinks, providing the ideal backdrop for what he intended to be a life-altering conversation. Indeed, Peter, as Cassandra adjusted her scarf and her eyes reflected the hues of the twilight, Peter stopped walking and took both of her hands in his. He made sure his gaze showed the depth of passion he needed her to feel. Cassandra's response was one of curiosity. "Cassandra, these last few months have been the most significant of my life. You've helped me realize what really matters in life, and I can't stop picturing a time when we won't have to part." Cassandra's eyes narrow a little, a flash of emotion and surprise running through her features. Peter interrupted her, holding her hands tenderly. "I understand that this may come as a shock, but will you marry me, Cassandra, when you know?" Peter's look was both hopeful and vulnerable, with a well-crafted mask that concealed any sense of the dishonesty underlying his request. His voice was earnest. Cassandra hesitated for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. The question was unexpected, but still shocking given how close they were. She looked at Peter, searching for any signs of dishonesty, but she eventually, the emotional wave that had been building inside of her gave way, and she whispered, "Yes, Peter, I will marry you," as they embraced. Peter had a wave of relief coupled with a pander of unidentifiable guilt that he hoped would be swiftly buried behind layers of explanation. He had told himself that he had secured his future, one that would put him back in his proper place. When friends and some family members learned about their engagement, opinions were divided. However, they were nonetheless congratulated. The children of Cassandra were noticeably shy and cautious in their congratulations. Talks about locations, guests, and dates started as the wedding preparations got underway. But Peter, ever the consummate actor, handled these complications with a grace that belied his genuine objectives. One evening, as they sat together in Cassandra's living room poring over guest lists, Peter pretended to be the loving fiancé, but even as they talked about meal selections and floral arrangements, his mind was elsewhere, calculating the next stages in his plan. With a contemplative love smile on his face, Peter glanced up at Cassandra. "Being with you, planning our future, is everything I've ever wanted." Grinned and reached to stroke his cheek. "I have the same sentiments, Peter." She turned back to the guest list, saying, "I can't wait to start our life together." Peter stared at her with cold eyes for a brief moment, before softening his expression to one of affection. Everything seemed to be falling into place, and he soon thought he would be able to live the life of luxury he had always wanted. But a persistent doubt was always there, like a nagging voice in the back of his mind, asking how long he could maintain this facade before the true cost of his actions became apparent. Amidst the whirlwind of preparations, the weeks after Peter and Cassandra's engagement were characterized by an enticing blend of anticipation and meticulous planning. The momentum of his upcoming marriage and the lifestyle it promised had almost convinced Peter that he could find contentment in this facade. However, the illusion of a perfect future was abruptly shattered one chilly March evening, when Cassandra invited him to her private residence. The beautifully appointed space spoke volumes of her taste and success. They were meant to review some last-minute wedding details, But as soon as Peter walked into the living room, he sensed something was amiss. Cassandra appeared to be sitting by the hearth with a burden that she had not mentioned, as seen by her more reserved demeanor and forced grin. Peter said, "Thank you for coming. We need to talk." Her voice was solid, but lacked the usual vigor. Peter said, sinking into an armchair across from her and smiling to hide his initial anxiety. "What's on your mind, Cassandra?" She inhaled deeply and twisted the ring he had given her uncomfortably. "I should have shared this earlier, but I was having trouble finding the right moment," she said, as she paused to find the right words. "It has been determined that I have a severe sickness." Peter felt as though the ground had moved beneath him as the words, "It's terminal," hung heavy in the air. His initial reaction was not worry, but rather an icy grip of dread over what this revelation meant for his plan's terminal. "But Cassandra, are you certain there has to be a mistake? Because that can't be correct?" he stammered, his thoughts rushing through several eventualities, each of them deviating from the road he had so meticulously outlined. "I've done all the tests, talked to the best doctors. This isn't a mistake," he said. Cassandra spoke calmly, accepting her fate, yet there was a deep sadness visible in her eyes. "I didn't want this to have an impact on us before I was certain and knew what it all meant." Peter's thoughts became disorganized, which altered everything. His carefully planned future suddenly teetered on the verge of uncertainty. But he knew he had to keep up the front of the loyal fiancé. Cassandra nodded, a tiny, appreciative smile brushing her lips. "I'm so sorry. This is devastating. But we'll face it together, all right? I knew I could rely on you," she added quietly, her relief apparent as the evening wore on, and she began to believe in his support. Peter's mind was racing with calculations and revisions as he heard Cassandra discuss her plans and anxieties, and gave the perfect response. He was also worried about how her health would affect their impending marriage. Driving home later that night, the weight of Cassandra's illness and its potential impact on his life sat heavy on his chest. It was a pivotal moment, one that demanded a reassessment of all his motives and strategies. The reality of her condition meant that their time together might be painfully short, and the wealth and security he had anticipated could evaporate with her passing. But as he mulled over his next steps, a dark resolve settled over him. If their time was to be limited, he would need to ensure that whatever time they had left together secured his future. He would have to play the part of the caring, devoted partner more convincingly than ever. His every action calculated to cement his place in her will to be seen by all as the grieving, deserving spouse. When the time came, the stakes were higher now, the game more perilous. But Peter was not deterred. If anything, he was more determined, driven not just by greed, but by the challenge of maintaining his deception under these new dire circumstances. As he lay in bed that night, the mask of the bereaved fiancé already forming in his mind. Following Cassandra's devastating health revelation, Peter, posing as a caring and loving partner, suggested they expedite their wedding plans. However, Peter felt a cold detachment from the woman he had promised to marry, viewing her not as his future wife, but as the last barrier in his quest for a restored life of luxury. With a tone that was expertly balanced between urgency and affection, he remarked, "Cassandra, my love, I think we should marry sooner, and we should cherish every moment we have left together." Cassandra, moved by what she saw as a deep commitment, said, "Yes, Peter, let's not wait. I can't think of a better way to spend whatever time I have left than as your wife." As a result, the wedding was arranged in a hurry at a magnificent estate overlooking the ocean. The grounds were decorated with thousands of white roses and twinkling lights, creating a fairy tale atmosphere that captivated every guest. Cassandra, radiant yet fragile, walked down the aisle, her smile a bittersweet testament to the complex web of emotions she felt. Peter played his part expertly. The doing groom, whose eyes shone with tears that were more a result of his acting talents than real emotion. With the wedding behind him and his position as Cassandra's husband legally secured, Peter maintained the facade of the loving husband. But as the weeks went by, his true nature started to show through the cracks in the carefully constructed persona he presented to the world. Peter's old habits returned, and he started to indulge in luxury, lavishing money on custom suits, exclusive golf club memberships, and spontaneous trips to far-off places. He claimed that these out-of-control spending habits were a way to make the most of their limited time together, but his actions were increasingly carried out alone. Cassandra's condition frequently made her weaker by the day, making it impossible for her to keep up with Peter's hectic lifestyle. Cassandra's health continued to deteriorate, but Peter's worries were directed elsewhere. He hosted extravagant parties at their estate, where the noise and drama stood in stark contrast to his wife's quiet suffering upstairs. He also started going out more and frequently returned home later, often in the wee hours of the morning, stinking of perfume and alcohol. On one of those nights, Cassandra awaited his arrival, her thin figure encased in a shawl. When Peter staggered through the door, her eyes dimmed with a mixture of agony and disappointment. She faced him, her voice faint, but full of a sorrow that sliced through his self-indulgent haze. "Peter," with obvious hurt in her voice, she said, "where have you been, and why are you doing this?" Peter, taken aback and irritated by the exchange, dismissed her worries with a callousness that even astounded him. "Cassandra, just trying to live life to the fullest, no matter how little time we have left. Isn't that what we wanted to do, Peter, not by abandoning me?" Cassandra looked away from her disappointment and responded, her voice breaking, a tangible presence in the space as Cassandra withdrew. And in the days that followed, Peter experienced a brief pang of guilt that was swiftly smothered by a rush of self-justification. He was entitled to this life, he reasoned. He had done his part, and now he was just claiming what he felt was his due. The thought of Peter's loving husband kept chipping away, exposing the calculating, self-centered guy beneath. As Cassandra's illness worsened, the dynamic in their home also grew more obvious, with the gap between her deteriorating health and his hedonistic lifestyle. As her health declined, Cassandra became more conscious of the distance between them, and started to have concerns about Peter's intentions. Her mind struggled to accept the possibility that the man she had married could not be the companion she had thought him to be. And this developing skepticism, combined with her physical illness, prepared the ground for a reckoning that would shake the foundations of their marriage and ultimately expose the real nature of the man she had trusted with her heart and her fortune. As spring blossomed, so did Peter's daily indulgences, marked by an increasing disdain for the vows he had taken so recently. His occasional nighttime excursions turned into a regular occurrence, portraying him as a very different husband from the loving one he had presented himself as in his earlier marriage to Cassandra. One seductive evening in late April, Peter found a new nightclub that catered to the city's elite and was renowned for its luxury and secrecy. This was where Peter started to completely disintegrate, and his decline into betrayal worsened. His old life's temptations were becoming too strong for him to resist. So he was sitting at the bar with a pricey glass of scotch in hand when he noticed a young woman named Eliza. She had a mischievous smile on her face, and she seemed to be drawn to him, despite the low murmur of conversation and the pulsing beat of the music. They engaged in flirtatious banter, and he felt an immediate and intense attraction to her. Eliza saw her eyes riveted to Peter's. Peter grinned back at her. "He seems to have a flame ignited by the thrill of the chase. And I think I'd like to go on a little adventure tonight." Their chat went as smoothly as the drinks, and soon Peter was asking Eliza to join him in one of the club's exclusive VIP areas. It was a world apart from his duties, a place where he could act as though the constraints of his marriage did not exist, even for a single night. As the evening wore on, Peter's antics became increasingly brazen as he and Eliza danced together, their bodies moving in time to the pulsating music, their laughter echoing over the sound system. Before the club closed, Peter had spent a small fortune on champagne and private entertainment. The receipts were proof of his foolishness. Soon after, they were joined by a group of young socialites, who were as reckless and carefree as Peter himself wished to be. He staggered out into the early morning light. Their laughter echoed down the still street, back at their mansion, with Eliza's arm wrapped between his. Cassandra was awake, her health declining, but her mind alert. She had observed the shifts in Peter during the late hours of the night, the inexplicable costs. Dawn broke into her study, her hands quivering slightly as she held a picture of them taken just after their wedding. The haunting melancholy in her eyes had replaced the happiness in the image. She could still smell the perfume that clung to his garments. When Peter eventually made it home, his gait shaky and his head hazy from drinking, he discovered Cassandra waiting for him in the living room, her face bearing a resigned look of melancholy. "Where have you gone, Peter?" Cassandra was out with some pals when she spoke softly and with obvious hurt in her eyes. "Cassandra and I lost count of time," as Peter deceitfully avoided her friend's sight. Cassandra voiced her suspicion, which is clear, is that Peter became enraged at the charge, losing his cool. "Yeah, just friends. Can a man go out for the evening?" Cassandra asked, her heart hurting from knowing that he was lying. "Peter, all I could aspire for was more candor between us." Peter gave a halting apology and withdrew to their bedroom, leaving Cassandra by herself to mull over her feelings. She knew something was seriously wrong, that her husband was leaving her behind and being replaced by a stranger with icy eyes and a hardened heart. Cassandra faced the facts of her failing marriage and her failing health, and she decided to find out the truth about Peter's nights, because it was obvious he was becoming more and more distant, and she needed to get ready for whatever was coming next. The idea that she might be fighting not just for her own health, but also against her husband's betrayal, weighed heavily on her, setting the stage for a confrontation that would come as nightfall. The shadows became longer till nightfall. Cassandra Thompson was experiencing increasing anxiety as her health declined over the last few days. As she got ready for bed, she had perhaps naively thought that Peter would spend the night at home, a reassuring presence by her side. However, she was disappointed to find that Peter was in their shared bedroom, carefully adjusting his tie in the mirror in preparation for another secretive night out. The smell of his cologne filled the room, a stark reminder of the growing distance between them. Cassandra, looking at him through the doorway, had a dejected yet hopeful expression on her face. "Will you be leaving again, Peter?" She was so tired that her voice was hardly audible, barely a whisper. Peter peered at her reflection in the mirror, briefly locking eyes with her before averting his gaze. "Yes, I have some important clients to attend to," he lied with ease and in a contemptuous tone. Cassandra nodded feebly, sensing she shouldn't push herself too hard. "Please try not to be late tonight," she muttered, her condition getting worse. "I'll attempt it," with a non-committal response. Peter turned his focus back to his appearance and made one last adjustment to his cufflinks before leaving the room, leaving himself increasingly ill, and with the gentle click of the door closing behind him. While this was going on, Peter was immersed in the vibrant nightlife of the city, surrounded by laughter and the clinking of glasses. Far removed from the grim reality of his wife's critical condition, Cassandra managed to get into bed, but the nights went by as her symptoms worsened, and a sharp pain clutching at her chest made her reach for the phone with trembling hands. Her breaths were shallow and labored when his phone began to buzz persistently in his pocket well after midnight. He became irritated and moved away from the lively group to answer it. His expression darkened as he listened to the voice on the other line. "Mr. Thompson, this is the hospital St. Luke's." The nurse's comments were a startling intrusion into his hedonistic escape. Your wife was admitted earlier tonight. She's in a severe condition. We need you to come as quickly as possible." In response, Peter said, "I'm currently tied up with an important meeting. I'll be there when I can." His tone was one of irritation rather than concern. The call was an unwanted obligation that he was reluctant to take on right away. He ended the call and lingered at the bar, his mind torn between annoyance at the disruption and worry for Cassandra. After another hour and several more drinks, he eventually left for the hospital. His wobbly gait as he arrived at the hospital, Peter looked disheveled, with the lights from the Stark Hospital creating long shadows on his face that emphasized his lack of concern. He discovered Cassandra unconscious, hooked up to a number of machines that beeped and spoke menacingly. Rather than evoking the worry of a loving husband, the doctor approached him, her expression solemn. "Mr. Thompson, we are doing everything we can for your wife. But I must emphasize how crucial family support is right now. Her health is quite bad." Peter waited beside Cassandra's bedside, waiting for her to wake. He nodded, his reaction reflexive. "Thank you, doctor. Please keep me updated." His words were the right ones, expected in such situations. But they were hollow, without genuine passion. Peter's thoughts were not on her suffering or the fear she might be feeling. Instead, his mind wandered to the complications her condition might cause him, the plans he had made, that her illness might disrupt this crisis. He realized was another obstacle in his path, not a call to compassion, but an inconvenience to be managed in that sterile hospital room. As the early hours of the morning ticked by, the true extent of Peter's selfishness was laid bare, a stark contrast to the vows of in sickness and in health he had so recently made. The stage was set for further revelations and decisions that would reveal the full depth of his character, decisions that would eventually come to define both their lives. The sterile, echoing corridors of St. Luke's Hospital were a stark contrast to the usual warmth and laughter that filled Cassandra's home as her children, Will and Clara, hurried through them. Anxiety and concern etched deep in their faces. They were unprepared for the further unsettling news they would receive upon their arrival. Mr. and Miss Thompson, a nurse, called out as they approached the reception desk. "I'm glad you're here. Your mother was asking for you. How is she? Can we see her?" Michael furrowed his brow, suspecting that Peter was already simmering and beginning to boil. "Late? How late?" he pressed, his tone sharper than intended. "About 3 hours, sir. I was on duty when the call was made, and when he arrived," the nurse explained, unaware of the tensions her words stirred. Clara asked, her voice tinged with urgency. "She's stable for now, but still unconscious. You can see her shortly." The nurse responded sympathetically, "But I thought you should know that Mr. Thompson was informed immediately after your mother was admitted." The sound of the heart monitor beeping served as a constant reminder of how serious their mother's condition was, and as they approached her bed, in the dim light of the hospital room, their worries began to surface. "Clara, there's a silent communication of shared doubt and concern," thanking the nurse. Within, each of them was lost in their own troubled thoughts. After a while, Michael remarked in a low voice, "Peter's behavior has been strange for a while, and now this is showing up." Clara nodded, her countenance grim. 3 hours late. What do we do about it? I've observed it. 2 late nights, evasiveness, and Mom seemed worried the last few times we spoke. I think it's time we find out exactly what Peter is up to, Michael said in a low, determined voice. Clara answered, let's hire a private investigator. If he's hiding something, we need to know for Mom's sake. The choice was taken quickly after they reached an agreement. And during the following several days, they got in touch with a respectable private investigative company and explained their need for secrecy and hurry. Jack Hartley, a seasoned investigator, was well briefed and recognized the delicate nature of the Cassia family, wishing to shield one of their own from possible damage from within their circle. As soon as Jack started working on the case, he started following Peter, going through his financial records and recording his nightly exploits. Soon, a pattern of frequenting upscale clubs and seeing different women, one of whom was Cassandra, began to emerge. As Jack compiled his findings, the evidence of Peter's betrayals grew stronger with every picture and in-depth report, painting a picture of a man living a double life apart from the loving husband that he presented to Cassandra. Meanwhile, Peter continued his dual existence by day, oblivious to the investigative storm that was building around him. A man indulges in his every whim at night, becoming bolder and more careless. Jack updated Michael and Clara in private meetings, their rising indignation at the information presented to them. In the final report, added to their concern about their mother, the siblings had to make a difficult decision about how to confront Peter. After receiving a comprehensive document outlining his infidelity and misdeeds, which was a damning test of his deceit. However, the stage was set for a confrontation that would not only expose Peter, but also test the very bonds of their family. In the quiet sterility of Cassandra Thompson's hospital room, a scene of familial solidarity and solemn uncoverings transpired. Holding the folder, carrying the proof of Peter's betrayals in Michael's hands, Michael and Clara stood at their mother's bedside, burdened by the results of their inquiry. "We have to show you something significant, Mom." Despite the chaos swirling inside of him, Michael started studying his voice. Cassandra nodded slightly, her pale features clouded by a sense of foreboding, while appearing awake and feeble. "What is it?" Michael glanced at Clara, who nodded encouragingly. Cassandra received the packet from Michael. Cassandra's hands trembled as she opened the folder, her eyes widening in disbelief as she sifted through the photographs and reports, detailing Peter's nocturnal activities, frequent outings to clubs, his liaisons with other women, and his extravagant spending. Each piece of evidence was a stab to her heart, her expression crumpling with each documented betrayal. "Peter investigated, Mom, and we were worried about his actions and how they might be affecting you," he explained in carefully chosen words. "Peter," she mumbled, her eyes full of sorrow. In those times, the guy she had loved and trusted was exposed as a stranger motivated by self-serving motives. Clara took a step forward her mother and put an arm around her shoulders. "Mom, we're so sorry. We didn't mean to hurt you, but we thought you should know," she said. Cassandra leaned in to give her kid a little consolation. Through physical contact, in the face of such heartbreaking facts, I needed to know that she was paying attention to me. "Because," she responded quietly, her voice full of resolve and suffering. As the truth of Peter's deceit began to sink in, Cassandra felt compelled to confront him and demand answers. But her physical weakness and the emotional toll of the revelation held her back. She needed time to gather her strength and get ready for the inevitable confrontation. While Peter stayed at home, recovering from yet another night of giving in to his whims, unaware of the impending storm, he relaxed in the living room, sipping coffee and browsing through his phone. His thoughts were already focused on his plans for the evening, and the contrast between his carefree lifestyle and the suffering he had caused. Neo. That evening, as Cassandra lay in her hospital bed with her children by her side, the chaos of the day gave way to a peaceful moment. Michael and Clara stayed by her side, their presence acting as a balm to her wounded spirit. As they talked, laughed softly, and reminisced about better times, giving Cassandra a much-needed diversion from her problems. Cassandra thanked them both, her eyes conveying her appreciation for their friendship. Cassandra appreciated the warmth of her children's care and the comfort of their presence, shielding her from the colder realities waiting outside the hospital room. But she also knew that she would soon have to face Peter in order to confront him with the evidence of his infidelity and decide the future of their marriage. Despite this, Cassandra allowed herself to enjoy the moment and found strength in the unwavering support of her children. The chapter concluded with the family unified in love and support. Despite the looming threat of an inevitable confrontation, the sterile silence of the hospital room contrasted sharply with the storm of emotions raging within Cassandra as she lay in her bed, still weak, but mentally sharper than she had been in days. Her thoughts had turned to the impending confrontation with Peter, which she knew was inevitable, but filled her with a mixture of dread and resolve. When Peter entered her hospital room the following day, his demeanor was that of a man out of place, more like a tourist visiting an attraction than a concerned husband. The way Cassandra was presented had an air of charm, but it didn't cover up the tension below. Cassandra said, "I've been better, but we need to talk about something essential." She held the folder with the proof of his betrayals on her lap, and gazed up at him calmly, despite the agony inside. Peter, who sensed a change in her tone, naturally tensed a little. "What is it that concerns us?" Cassandra started gripping the folder more tightly, or rather, "It's about you and what you're doing." Cassandra went on to present the evidence of Peter's wild evenings, his lavish spending, and most damning of all his affairs, with receipts, photos, and in-depth reports arranged on the bed between them. A material manifestation of his dishonesty. Peter was shocked at first, but as he searched for an explanation, his disbelief turned to defensive wrath. "Cassandra," he stumbled as he attempted to take back control of the story. "But these reports and images aren't what they seem to be. From where I'm sitting, it appears like you've been leading a life quite different from the one we agreed upon." "Peter," Cassandra's voice was icy, and her eyes never left his. His face was flushed with annoyance and a trace of fear. "Cassandra, you must see that I was only attempting to manage the stress of your illness. I didn't intend for things to spiral out of control to the point where you were betraying me by using our money on other women." Cassandra's reply sliced through his justifications. As the weight of his deeds and her knowledge of them settled over Peter, his composure started to crumble. He reached out in a characteristic gesture to bridge the gap between them. But Cassandra retreated, her withdrawal creating a clear boundary he could no longer cross. "I believe you should leave," Peter said, raising her voice. Resolute. "I need time to myself so I can go through my options." With every step Peter took away from her room, left alone, his mind raced with the possibility of losing everything he had worked so hard to secure, the life of luxury he craved. Peter stood, the rejection stinging him more than he expected. His plans, his future, now hung precariously in the balance, dependent on the decisions of a woman he had underestimated, a woman he had betrayed. Cassandra collapsed onto her pillows as the papers scattered all around her served as a sharp reminder of the betrayal she had experienced. The encounter had worn her out, but there was also a sense of comfort in knowing the truth was now known. She closed her eyes. Her thoughts drifted from the pain of the betrayal to the strength she would need to face what came next. This quiet moment, though painful, was hers alone. A chance to gather the broken pieces of her trust and decide the path forward. A path defined not by betrayal, but by her own enduring resilience. Her mind was tired, but her spirit was beginning to forge a new resolve. She knew the next steps would be crucial, not just for her heart, but for her dignity and her future. The morning following the altercation, Peter was living alone in the expansive estate he had grown to regard as a representation of his elevated status, rather than as a joint residence with Cassandra. The luxury surroundings felt stifling, with each lavish room resonating with the ghosts of his past transgressions and an ominous feeling. Stillness on his hazy future, Peter walked the living room, which had formerly been the scene of many lavish parties, but was now a calm space for his dizzying thoughts. His thoughts drifted to the days of unbridled luxury provided by his father's wealth, the wild nights out with no care for tomorrow, and the sharp contrast of those grim months flipping burgers at a fast food joint for minimum wage. The memory of that drudgery filled him with dread. The nightmare of returning to such a mundane existence was now a tangible threat hanging over him like a dark cloud. His mind was a chaotic mix of fear and regret, not for the pain he had caused Cassandra, but rather for the potential loss of the luxurious lifestyle he had grown accustomed to, once again. He slumped into an overstuffed chair as Peter poured himself a drink. His hand trembled. The sound of the ice clinking on the glass was abnormally loud in the quiet room. As he swallowed, the burn of the alcohol did little to ease his frayed nerves. The minutes passed, the hours passed, and the waiting and fretting continued forever. As the day wore on into the evening, Peter's anxiety increased even more as he relived the confrontation with Cassandra in his mind, dissecting every word and expression in an attempt to predict what would happen next. Would she reject him, perhaps influenced by the memories of their time together? Or would she forgive him and take away the security and comfort he had worked so hard to achieve? For the first time in a long time, Peter felt stuck, in a state of undefined uncertainty about the course of his life. This lack of control was an emotion he hated above all else, and it was something he was unable to bear. The house was no longer silent as Peter went outside into the cool evening air. He gazed over the well-kept lawns and shimmering pool, which seemed like a kingdom that might soon escape his grasp. After coming inside, he poured another drink, his third, then a fourth. And as night fell on the house, the alcohol eased his anxiety, but made him feel even more fear and dread. He staggered up to the bedroom and collapsed onto the bed without bothering to undress. Peter's sleep was restless, tormented by visions. In his subconscious mind of being back at the fast food counter, of public disgrace and poverty, of Cassandra's disappointed face as she turned him away, and of living once more in the shadows of society. As he tossed and turned, the sheets twisted around him. The overwhelming feeling Peter experienced was one of dread, a premonition that the house of cards he had built was about to collapse in the solitude of the night, leaving only his fears for company. Peter's mind was a whirlwind of desperation and plotting, even in his dreams. For the first time in a long time, Peter felt the sting of his own conscience, though it only gently spoke to him through the storm of his other darker desires. Peter was forced to face the possibility that the consequences of his actions were about to catch up with him. The uncertainty of what the next day might bring was a weight too heavy to bear. The telephone's incessant ringing broke the morning sun just as it was beginning to rim the horizon. "The quiet of Peter's estate," he answered. "Peter Thompson," in a mumbled attempt to break through the fog of sleep. Groggy and disoriented from his fitful sleep, he ignored the first two calls, his mind still entangled in the memories of his nightmares. It wasn't until the third persistent ring that he, groggy, reached for the receiver. "Mr. Thompson, this is St. Luke's Hospitals, Dr. Lucas." The voice on the other end was solemn, professional, and undeniably frantic. A wave of terror shot through Peter's veins, his thoughts racing with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. "I need you to come to the hospital as soon as possible. It's urgent." Peter drove to the hospital, his thoughts racing with fear and calculation. When he arrived, he saw Michael and Clara there, their faces etched with grief and despair. The sight of their tears momentarily confused him until Dr. Lucas approached with heavy steps and a grave expression. Cassandra was going to divorce him. Had she decided to expose him completely and strip him of everything? His heart pounded with the fear of losing the luxurious lifestyle he was so close to securing forever. "Mr. Thompson, I regret to notify you that Mrs. Thompson, your wife, passed away early this morning as a result of complications from her sickness," which the doctor gently announced. The information struck Peter felt as though he had been struck physically, not by grief, but rather by the unexpected liberation that came with Cassandra's death, which meant that there would be no confrontation, divorce, or revelation of his lie, only a twisted knot of anxiety in his gut. Peter unwound into a hidden, humiliating relief. forced himself to put on an appropriately distraught facade while he took care of the urgent necessities. In stark contrast to the cold calculation that settled in his own heart. After handling the formalities at the hospital and making sure he appeared, he watched as Michael and Clara clung to each other there, sobbing, nodding and responding appropriately to the condolences offered by hospital staff and Cassandra's children. The bereaved spouse, Peter, went back to the estate. Moving through the rooms of his mansion, his future plans started to take shape. He thought of more extravagant trips, lavish parties, maybe even new business ventures, now that he was free to indulge himself without having to hide them. The drive back was surreal, his mind struggling to accept the reality that he was now the sole master of the vast wealth Enlea had left behind. Even as he contemplated his newfound freedom, a part of him remained cautious. He knew he had to maintain appearances, especially in the coming days. The funeral and the will. Reading these events required a grieving widower, not a man relieved at his sudden fortune. Given their misgivings and grief, Michael and Clara remain a potential threat that must be handled carefully given the mansion's seclusion. Peter started getting ready for the funeral, planning the most exquisite and somber event possible that would undoubtedly show everyone how deeply he was loved and missed. Cassandra was getting ready for his eulogy and arranging his black outfit. Peter experienced a mixture of eagerness and regret while he lamented the passing of his independence during these performances. He was also excited about the life that awaited him in this intricate web of feelings and plans. Once the curtains dropped, the day of Cassandra Thompson's funeral dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the heavy hearts of those who gathered to bid her farewell. The small church was filled to capacity, a testament to the lives she had touched through her philanthropy, her business. Peter continued to navigate his world, a world that was now entirely at his command, but still shadowed by the roles he had to play, at least for a little while longer. Among the mourning were Cassandra's children, who were known for their acumen and kindness. Friends, co-workers, and extended family members offered gentle words of consolation to Michael and Clara, who were clearly frightened and united in their grief. Their faces, marred by tears, served as a moving reminder of the severity of their loss, and their voices murmured softly against the somber songs that pervaded the atmosphere. As the service went on, the eulogies painted a picture of Cassandra as a woman of immense warmth and generosity. Peter, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, played the part of the bereaved husband with a practiced ease. His face was set in a mask of sorrow, and his eyes occasionally moistened with artificial tears. He accepted the condolences with nods and murmured thanks. Each story emphasizes even more the contrast between the grieving husband's outward persona and his inner reality of relief and future intentions. The tension momentarily broke when Clara, overcome with grief and anger, suddenly stood and pointed an accusing finger at Peter. "This is your fault," she cried out, "breaking your lies and selfishness." The church fell silent, and all eyes turned to Clara before turning to Peter. Peter listened to his expression of attentive mourning, even as his mind wandered to the substantial inheritance that awaited him. Michael moved swiftly to embrace his sister, Clara, and tried to calm her down with a firm but quiet voice. "This isn't the right moment to pay tribute to Mom without making a commotion. Remember, good things happen to those who deserve them. Instead, let's concentrate on saying our final goodbyes to Mom." For a brief moment, Peter was taken aback, but he soon collected himself. He bowed his head and adopted an even more solemn expression, appearing to be genuinely upset by the charge, but too dignified to defend himself in such a sacred moment. The spectators' murmurs of compassion were mixed with confusion. The tension persisted even after Clara calmed down and the service continued, with some people looking at Peter with a renewed tiredness. When the last prayers were performed and Cassandra's casket was carefully brought to the hearse, The gathering began to join the mournful procession, slow march under the warm sun. The air was heavy with unsaid accusations and sorrow. As the mourners said their final goodbyes, Peter continued to act the part of the bereaved spouse by walking next to the casket with his head lowered. As the throng started to thin, Peter stood beside the grave, his face a mask of sorrow that concealed the cold calculation beneath. As he drove away from the cemetery, Peter felt the last of his ties to his previous life of pretense slowly dissolving. He was free now, free to indulge in the wealth Cassandra had left behind, without the need to maintain the exhausting charade of a loving husband. However, despite his relief, a part of him remained, aware of the potential repercussions that Clara's outburst might provoke. Weeks after Cassandra's fun, feral Peter was leading the lavish lifestyle he had always dreamed of, and the mansion was filled with the sounds of music, laughter, and clinking glasses, with an unending stream of people admiring the opulence that Peter flaunted without restraint. Lavish parties became the norm almost every night. His days were spent traveling to upscale clubs, taking expensive vacations, and spending time with attractive women who were all too eager to partake in the opulent lifestyle he offered. One evening, as one such party approached its climax with the mansion filled with revelers and the air filled with the aroma of pricey perfumes and liquors, the unexpected occurred. As the music continued to pulse around the mansion, the closest guests became silent as they watched Michael and Clara meet the stern-looking man holding a briefcase, definitely an attorney. The enormous doors of the mansion suddenly opened, revealing Michael and Clara. In an instant, the joyous mood gave way to apprehension and unease. When Peter, who was entertaining a group close to the main door, noticed them, he felt a wave of frigid dread. His first reaction was shock, but as he walked up to them, his face twisted into a sneer. He demanded that his voice be heard loudly above the music. Michael moved forward, his expression serious. Peter, ignoring the lawyer's boiling, stated, "We need to talk about the estate and Mom's last wishes," trying to keep a respectful tone. Peter was given a document by preamble. "In accordance with Mrs. Thompson's last will and testament, Mr. Thompson, you must leave the property right away. Her children will receive the property, together with all of its belongings, including the cars." Peter's expression went scarlet, matching the pricey wine in his glass. When did she decide to alter her will? The day before she died, he spluttered in wrath, his voice shaking. The attorney quietly explained, obliging to Peter's mounting rage. Mrs. Thompson changed a number of important things to make sure her estate would benefit her kids rather than you, Mr. Thompson. Peter was reminded of the day Cassandra had confronted him about his infidelity, and how he had been left in suspense, wondering what she would decide to do about their marriage. Now, it was evident what she had been doing to safeguard her kid's future and keep her assets safe from him. The crowd watched in a mixture of shock and sympathy as Peter's public persona crumbled. Forced to face the ruin of his plans, he found himself powerless, as his previous manipulations rendered futile against Cassandra's final act of defiance. Peter's mind reeled as the lawyer continued to outline the disposition of Cassandra's assets, none of which included him. As the finality of the situation set in, his initial shock gave way to a blinding rage. "This is impossible. I'm her husband by rights. Everything should come to me," he shouted, his voice echoing through the now quiet room. As Peter packed his most personal belongings, Michael and Clara watched him, their expressions a mixture of sorrow and relief. The house slowly emptied, the partygoers dispersing under the weight of the drama, leaving behind only the cold, hard truth of Peter's defeat. The magnitude of Peter's loss was overwhelming. Not only had he lost the wealth he had so craved, but he was also being expelled from the luxurious life he had deemed his destiny. Now, all that awaited him was an uncertain future, deprived of the opulence he had so cunningly secured. "Before you leave," Clara stepped closer to him and smiled slightly, but not until her eyes met his. Peter was given a huge packet with hefty contents in her hands. As she stated, her tone tinged with cynicism, "Mom did leave something for you." Peter looked at the envelope warily, unsure if he should prepare for another strike or a small memento. "What is this?" he asked, his voice wary. "It's a manuscript," Clara responded, her stare unwavering. "My mother composed it because she believed you ought to have it." Peter accepted the envelope with a mixture of curiosity and dread. And without saying anything more, he left the mansion. The reality of his circumstance being poor and without security weighed heavily on him. But the manuscript caught his attention, so he took a seat to read under the shade of an old oak tree on the edge of the property. As he turned the pages, the words Cassandra had written washed over him like a cold tide. The paper chronicled decades of business deals, across rails and dark secrets that had led to the ruin of many, including his own father. It was a thorough account of the lengthy and tangled relationship between the Thompson and Parker families. Cassandra disclosed that she had painstakingly planned the retaliation against his father. The retaliation sprang from a grudge against the Wright family, who had mistreated her own family years prior, with her father being devastated by Peter's grandfather's merciless business practices, ultimately leading to ruin and hopelessness. Peter's hands trembled as he read about how Cassandra, in spite of her first misgivings, had purposefully intervened in his life to exact her family's retribution. Cassandra had watched his father fall from grace, from the shadows. And when Peter emerged, weak and desperate, she saw an opening to manipulate the last remaining right. The paper explained in detail how each step she took was planned to take advantage of every apparent vulnerability, though she tried to entice Peter further into her web. There were times when she expressed genuine conflict in hopes that Peter would prove to be different from his ancestors and possibly end the cycle of greed and betrayal that defined the Wright lineage. Ultimately, though, as Cassandra's words revealed, Peter had shown himself to be ambitious, manipulative, and self-serving, and the realization hit him like a punch to the face. He had been outplayed at his own game, and was only a pawn in a much larger scheme of retaliation. The manuscript's last pages contained the most damaging information. Cassandra bemoaned her dejection and acceptance, stating that Peter had, in fact, become just another Wright. She ended on a terrifying note. After reading the manuscript, Peter's initial shock turned into a burning rage, realizing that he had been duped and that his life and actions had been dictated by a plan that had been set in motion before he was even fully a part of it. The manuscript was to be published as a book that would expose the sordid history and ongoing malevolence of the Wright family from his grandfather's era to his own. The soon-to-be public text would destroy any possibility of his regaining his reputation or finding comfort in his anonymity. The notion of the world perusing Cassandra's story and interpreting him through the prism of his family's transgressions and his own shortcomings was intolerable. He got to his feet, holding the manuscript firmly in his hand, his thoughts racing over the possible consequences of its release. Peter's future, once filled with visions of luxury and ease, now loomed before him as a battleground. He needed to find a way to counter the narrative, to salvage what little he could of his dignity and his life. But as the shadows lengthened and the first stars appeared in the evening sky, Peter felt the isolation of his plight deeply. The world he knew had crumbled, and the path forward was shrouded in the darkness of his own making. The stage was set for a final act, one where Peter would have to confront not only the consequences of his past actions, but also the reality of the legacy he was destined to leave behind. After a night fraught with turmoil and a cascade of revelations, Peter found himself driving to his mother's modest home in the suburbs, the one place he never thought he'd return to under such dire circumstances. He arrived late. The lights inside, glowing softly against the darkness of the night. Edna Parker, once a matriarch of considerable influence, now lived a much quieter life. Her circumstances diminished significantly after the arrest of her husband and the subsequent scandals. When Peter, her only son, appeared at her doorstep looking haggard and desperate, her shock was palpable. She ushered him in and looked at him, her eyes sweeping from his untidy appearance between profound, weary sighs and curiosity over what on earth had occurred. Peter recapped the events of the previous few days, including his abrupt departure from the luxury he had become accustomed to, and the damning book that had dealt Cassandra a strategic posthumous blow. The following morning, as Peter and Edna sat in the tiny, claustrophobic kitchen, with mugs of cold coffee between them, gave no comfort as Edna listened in horror, her hand covering her lips as her already shaking world proceeded to crumble further. A strong marketing campaign backed by Cassandra's professional contacts, who were eager for the right family to fail, helped spread the word about her book. The manuscript-turned-book detailed the evil deeds of the Parker family in shocking clarity, revealing secrets that not even the police had uncovered. The revelations prompted law enforcement to reopen investigations into the family's business dealings, with particular attention now turned towards Edna as an accomplice in her husband's crimes. Before noon, police cars pulled up to Edna's home. The book was everywhere. It dominated headlines, buzzed across social media, and even appeared on buses and billboards throughout the city. With his mother's confused cries piercing the peaceful morning air, Peter watched helplessly, frozen in place as officers escorted her away in handcuffs. The house and the remaining assets of the right were taken, leaving Peter with nothing more than the clothes on his back, and a mounting sense of despair as the events happened so quickly. The city that had once revered the right name now whispered it with contempt. Every whisper of the wind seemed to echo Cassandra's words from her book. Every shadow in the evening streets served as a reminder of the empire he had lost. As night fell, Peter tried to contact his sisters in hopes of finding refuge or assistance, but his calls were unanswered. Later, he would learn that both had left the country, choosing to distance themselves from the unfolding scandal. Destitute, Peter wandered the streets, the weight of his family's legacy, a legacy now tainted by greed, bet, and ruin, bearing down on him. Peter found himself at a public park, sitting on a cold bench, staring out at a lake, shimmering under the city lights. The man who once had everything, now had nothing but his thoughts and the haunting realization that his downfall was both his and his family's making. In this moment of profound isolation, Peter grappled with the reality of his situation, the luxury he had lived in, the respect he had commanded. Everything had been built on a foundation of deceit, and now he was paying the price. As he looked out over the dark waters, he contemplated his next steps, unsure of where to go or what to do, but acutely aware that the path he chose next would determine whether he continued to live in the shadow of his family's dark legacy, or found a way to forge a new, albeit humbler path. Years had passed since the tumultuous events that led to the complete unraveling of Peter Parker's life. The once opulent existence, filled with dreams of eternal luxury, financed by deceit and manipulation, had long since fed into a stark and grim reality. Peter, who had lived a life envied by many, now found himself grappling with the basic necessities of survival. He had moved far from the city that knew his name, far from the scandal and the shame that had clung to him in the aftermath of Cassandra's calculated revelations. Now he found himself in a small rural town where nobody knew his history or his family's notorious legacy. Here, amidst the endless fields and quiet country lanes, Peter sought to rebuild his life from the very bottom. His days were spent in menial labor, a stark contrast to his previous life, after being turned away by multiple employers who were reluctant to hire someone with his tarnished reputation. Even a fast food joint that once employed him out of desperation. Peter had no choice but to turn to the local farmers for work. He found himself doing the most humble of tasks, cleaning animal stalls, a job that involved long hours in the company of livestock and the pervasive smell of manure every day. As he shoveled and scrubbed, he realized the irony of his situation. He thought about how far he had fallen, the grandeur of his past life, the parties, the luxuries, and the power. Meals that had once been lavish affairs were now little more than a means of getting by. Frequently, he found himself sitting on an old, splintered bench next to the barn, eating whatever meager portions the farm could spare. These moments of quiet reflection were filled with regret and a deep sense of loss. Every bite he took caused him to reflect on the decisions he had made, the people he had abused, and the lives he had ruined, including his own. The food in his bowl, which at times was little more than scraps, served as a daily reminder of his steep decline. Peter would look out over the vast fields as the sun set. It was a bitter pill to swallow in this new existence, far from the world he once dominated, to realize that his pursuit of wealth and status had brought him to this low point. Peter had plenty of time to reflect, and wondered if there was ever a moment he could have turned back before it was too late. However, such thoughts offered little solace, as the loneliness was palpable. Without the flurry of socialites, business partners, and fair weather friends painting the sky with colors he once would have paid an artist to capture on canvas, Peter was forced to face the man he had become through the years of greed and deception. It was during these introspections that Peter truly understood the cost of his actions, measured not in dollars, but in the profound sense of loss, an exile from the world he once thought he owned. In the evenings, after a hard day's work, he would sit by a small fire outside the modest shack he now called home, staring into the flames that flickered like the remnants of his former life. Peter Parker, stripped of his former glory, faced the chilling truth that he had achieved the luxurious life he had desired, but at what cost? Now, all he had were the fading embers of his past mistakes and the cold reality of a future filled with nothing but the echo of what once was. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. The suggested video below will definitely surprise you. Have a good session, and I'll see you in the next story.